You actually think a janitor can succeed where 14 professionals failed?
That's what the billionaire's own board laughed in Vincent Hale's face. Just weeks before her two daughters, silent for 13 straight months, ran straight into his arms instead of their mothers. Let's go back to the beginning, to a modest apartment on Chicago's South Side, where none of this had happened yet. And Vincent Hale still believed simply showing up was the only thing he needed to know how to do. Vincent Hale was 41 years old, and he believed exactly one thing with his whole chest. If a man showed up every single day and loved his son with everything he had, that boy would be all right. Even on the nights when the world looked straight through him like he wasn't even standing there. 3 weeks ago, at Alan's 5th grade science night in Bridgeport, a mother in a camel hair coat had looked at Vincent's steel-toed boots, then at his cracked knuckles, then simply looked away, like he was a smudge on the gymnasium floor she'd rather not step in. She never said a word. She didn't have to. Vincent smiled at his son's baking soda volcano anyway and drove home in a minivan with 211,000 miles on it. What almost nobody in that gymnasium knew was that the man in the faded work jacket had once kept 3 soldiers alive on a mountainside outside Kandahar, with nothing but a field kit, steady hands, and 11 years of training the Army gave him. Vincent never mentioned it. Some things a man just carries quiet. He woke most mornings at 4:50 a.m., $47 in his checking account until Friday's paycheck. 2 jobs on his schedule, and 1 son asleep down the hall who didn't know how close they'd come to the lights getting shut off. Before we get into the story, if you've ever had somebody take one look at you and decide they already knew everything about who you were, stay right here. Because what happens to Vincent Hale over these next few weeks is going to remind you why quiet strength always outlasts the people who never bothered to look twice. The apartment sat on the 2nd floor of a brick building on South Halsted Street, Bridgeport, Chicago. The kind of block where the L train rattled the windows and neighbors still said good morning. At 5:15 a.m., Vincent stood at the stove in a Blackhawks t-shirt gone soft from 100 washes, flipping eggs while Alan's cereal spilled clean across the counter because the boy had tried to pour it one-handed. "You're going to owe me a whole box of Cheerios one of these days," Vincent said, not looking up. "The old dragon's making a noise again," Alan said instead, meaning the minivan, which had earned that nickname the winter its heater died, and it groaned like something ancient every time it started. Vincent had promised to fix the belt on Saturday. He'd promised the porch swing a fresh coat of paint back in June, too. It still creaked. His neighbor, Miss Betty, always said a house wasn't a home till something in it complained. By 6:40, Alan was dropped at Bridgeport Elementary. By 7 o'clock, Vincent had clocked in at his first job, a maintenance shift at a strip mall on Archer Avenue. By 10 o'clock that night, he'd be 3 miles north and 48 floors up, pushing a mop cart through a world that didn't look anything like Halsted Street. 14 nannies, 13 months. That was the number Peyton Crow stared at on her iPad when the 14th resignation letter landed in her inbox at 11:47 p.m. Her nails were the color of dried blood, her diamond the size of a bottle cap, and she deleted the email without reading past the first line. She already knew what it would say. The penthouse took up the entire 48th floor of a tower on East Lakeshore Drive, Chicago's Gold Coast. White marble floors so polished they looked wet, floor-to-ceiling glass staring out over the black water of Lake Michigan at night. In the window seat sat her daughters. Hadley Crow, 7 years old, hugged a worn, stuffed rabbit that had belonged to her father. Collins, her twin, traced meaningless shapes into the fog on the glass with one finger. Neither girl cried. Neither girl spoke. They simply looked through everything, the way people look through a room they've already decided holds nothing for them. Peyton had built a $3.8 billion pharmaceutical empire out of nothing. She had negotiated with the FDA and closed deals that made international headlines. She could not get her own daughters to meet her eyes. 13 months earlier, her husband, Ethan Crow, had died in a crash on Lakeshore Drive on his way to pick the girls up from Francis W. Parker School. A skid on black ice in freezing rain that investigators ruled a genuine accident, nothing more. Hadley and Collins had stood outside in freezing rain for 2 hours and 11 minutes before anyone thought to tell them why their father never came. They hadn't said a real word since. $2 million in therapy. 3 specialists flown in from the Mayo Clinic. Nothing had worked. Her phone buzzed. A text from the board. Restructuring vote moving up. Gerald pushing hard again. Peyton set it face down and turned back to her desk. And that's when an old envelope slid loose from the back of a drawer and landed at her feet. Inside was a single page in Ethan's handwriting, written days before he died. If anything ever happens to me, find the person who actually sees our girls, not another expert, just that. And don't trust Gerald. He was at the funeral, and he smiled. Peyton's hand crushed the paper before her mind had even finished the sentence. She dropped it in the trash can beside her desk and walked away. She never saw the security footage from 13 months earlier, grainy, forgotten on an old hard drive, that showed Gerald Vance standing outside the chapel doors the day of Ethan's funeral, smiling as 2 little girls went silent forever. Down on the ground floor, a mop cart rolled out of a service elevator and into the lobby, its wheels squeaking the same complaint it always made. Vincent Hale had no idea that in a few hours he'd be standing in that penthouse, and that a broken vase was about to change 4 lives forever. The call came in at 10:40 p.m. The regular housekeeping service had called off sick for the 3rd time that month, and building management needed someone, anyone, to cover the 48th floor before the morning staff arrived. Vincent Hale had never once set foot inside a private residence in that tower. He'd cleaned lobbies, elevators, the gym on 12. Never a home. He stepped off the private elevator into a world that didn't feel lived in at all. Toys still sat in their boxes, unopened, price tags dangling. A grand piano stood in the corner. A fine gray film of dust settled across its closed lid. 13 months of dust. Nothing in that penthouse looked like a place children actually grew up in. It looked like a museum built to imitate one. Then came the sound. The sharp, unmistakable crash of crystal hitting marble, coming from a room down the hall marked, absurdly, Playroom, in gold script on the door. Vincent moved toward it out of instinct, the same instinct that used to send him running toward gunfire instead of away from it. He found Hadley standing frozen over the shattered remains of a vase, her small hands trembling at her sides. Collins was curled into the corner of the room, knees pulled to her chest, arms locked over her head like she was bracing for a sound that never came. Vincent didn't yell. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't even walk fully into the room. He set his cart down in the doorway, crouched to gather the broken glass into a dustpan, and started talking. Quietly, almost to himself, the way you'd talk to settle a spooked horse. "When my son was about your age," he said, not looking at either girl. "He knocked an entire bookshelf over trying to reach a box of cookies on the top shelf. Books everywhere. Broke a lamp, too. We laughed so hard about it we forgot to even be mad." He kept sweeping. "Cookies were worth it," he said. Still says it. Nobody answered him. He didn't expect anyone to. He mopped the floor slow and even, humming nothing in particular under his breath. And that's when Hadley, for the first time in 13 months, moved toward a stranger instead of away from one. She bent down and picked up a single wilted flower that had fallen from the broken vase, holding it like it mattered. A moment later, Collins uncurled from the corner and crossed the room to help her sister gather the rest of the petals. Vincent kept his eyes on the floor and let them be. Later, wiping down the base of the broken vase, his fingers found something taped to the underside. A small USB drive, wrapped tight in black electrical tape, hidden where it was never meant to be found. Vincent didn't ask questions. He slipped it into the pocket of his work apron and said nothing. His phone buzzed a minute later. Alan, calling on FaceTime from their apartment in Bridgeport, was supposed to be asleep. "Dad," the boy whispered, squinting at the screen. "Why do you have a USB drive from some stranger's house?" "Go to sleep, bud," Vincent said, and meant it kindly. "I'll explain when I understand it myself." Over the next 2 weeks, small things kept happening. Nothing that made headlines, nothing that changed a single fact about the Crow family's billion-dollar world, and yet, everything. Vincent helped Hadley tie her shoelace one evening after she'd refused, for 13 straight months, to let anyone so much as touch her sneakers. He said nothing about it, just knelt down, tied the bow, and moved on to the next room, like it was no different from wiping a counter. He let Alan teach the twins to draw over FaceTime one rainy afternoon. A lopsided cartoon figure holding a mop, which the boy christened Mop Man, with the total confidence of a 10-year-old. Hadley drew 3 versions that week. Collins colored hers in carefully, staying inside every line. And on a night when thunder rattled the tower's windows and Collins pressed herself flat against the hallway wall, Vincent, who happened to be there mopping, who happened to keep a roll of butterscotch candy in his apron pocket, held one out at arm's length, said nothing, and let her decide whether to take it. She took it. She held it in her fist the rest of the night without unwrapping it, like it was something worth saving. None of it should have mattered. All of it did. Peyton noticed the changes before she let herself believe them. A shoelace tied without a fight. A crayon drawing taped, unprompted, to the refrigerator door. Hadley humming, actually humming, some tuneless little melody while she colored at the kitchen table. Peyton told herself it was coincidence, that grief came in waves, that 7-year-olds had good weeks for no reason at all. She did not yet let herself wonder about the quiet man with the mop cart who came and went on a schedule she barely noticed. Not everyone in that tower was glad to see it. Emerson Quinn, Peyton's chief of staff for 11 years, pulled Vincent aside near the service elevator one morning, her voice low and clipped. "You need to understand the optics here," she said. "A grown man, alone with the girls, no background clearance from the family. The board will use this. They're already using it." She wasn't wrong. 2 days later, the Chicago Tribune ran 4 paragraphs under the headline, "Mystery Man Spotted at Gold Coast Penthouse." By the end of the week, Gerald Vance, chairman of the board, a man Vincent had never once spoken to, had left a message with building management demanding Vincent be terminated by end of day. "A janitor has no business in a private residence," the message said, clipped and final. Vincent listened to it once, standing in the parking garage on Michigan Avenue with his keys still in his hand, and felt the old, familiar weight settle back onto his shoulders. He didn't argue with the message. He drove home to Bridgeport, made Alan's lunch for the next day, and went back to work the following night anyway, because nobody had told him yet that he couldn't. Then came the night that changed everything Vincent thought he understood about the last 3 weeks. Emerson found him alone in the service hallway, her hands shaking as she held out her phone. "I need you to hear this before you decide anything," she said. "I need you to hear what he said." The recording was old, the audio thin, but the words were unmistakable. Gerald Vance's voice, recorded the week after Ethan Crow's funeral, speaking to someone off mic. "Just keep them mute another 18 months. Stock drops enough, I buy the company out from under her. You stay quiet, I'll double what I'm paying you." Emerson's voice broke. "I took his money once," she said, "because I'd lost a child of my own years ago, and grief makes you willing to look away from things you shouldn't. I'm done looking away. Starting tonight, I'm on the other side." Vincent said nothing for a long moment. Then he reached into his apron and closed his hand around the small, black tape drive he still hadn't opened. That same week, in the Crow kitchen, Peyton found 4 words smeared across the tile backsplash in her own lipstick, in handwriting too small and shaky to belong to anyone but a 7-year-old. He sees. Daddy said find him. She stood there a long time, reading it over and over, understanding none of it, and having absolutely no idea that the answer was already riding a mop cart up and down her building every single night. Somewhere in a downtown boardroom, Gerald Vance was already dialing the number of a lawyer. And somewhere in Vincent Hale's apron pocket, a hidden USB drive was waiting to be opened, carrying a message from a dead man that would blow this entire family's world apart. Emerson took Gerald's hush money once, after burying a child of her own. Does grief like that earn her a second chance, or does no excuse cover what she let happen to 2 little girls? Comment Team Forgive or Team Never Again, and we'll see which side is winning. The boardroom sat on the 31st floor of a tower on North Michigan Avenue, all dark wood and city views, and Gerald Vance stood at the head of the table like he already owned it. Emerson Quinn sat 2 chairs down, hands folded so tightly in her lap the knuckles had gone white, saying nothing, watching everything. Terminate the janitor within 24 hours, Gerald said, straightening his tie with the calm of a man who had never once been told no. A stranger? No vetting, no clearance, alone with 2 vulnerable children. The optics alone should have ended this weeks ago. Or this board holds a vote of no confidence by the end of the week. Your choice, Peyton. He said it like a foregone conclusion, and around the table, heads nodded along with him. Not because they believed it, but because none of them wanted to be the ones still standing when the vote came. She didn't have the strength left to argue. She rode the elevator down 48 floors in silence and walked straight into the penthouse, still wearing her coat. And when she found Hadley in the playroom, she did something she hadn't done in 13 months. She got down on her knees until her eyes were level with her daughter's. "Do you want Mr. Hale to stay?" Peyton asked, her voice cracking clean down the middle. Hadley looked at her mother for exactly 1 second. Then she turned and ran. Peyton stayed on her knees on the marble floor long after the footsteps faded. And when her body finally gave out, she folded forward and wept into her own hands. Alone, in a home that cost more than most people's entire lives, and had never once felt like one. She didn't hear Hadley come back into the room 5 minutes later. Hadley was holding 2 things. The first was the original Mopman drawing Alan had taught her to make weeks earlier, except now it wasn't the same drawing anymore. Over 3 quiet weeks, in secret, with quiet, careful patience, Hadley had added to it. A second figure stood a little apart from Mopman now. A woman with yellow hair, standing a small distance away, her face drawn with a single downturned line for a mouth. And above both figures, a small sun, low in the corner of the page, like something just beginning to rise. Hadley set the drawing gently in her mother's lap. Then she crossed the room, walked straight past Peyton's open arms, and wrapped both her small arms around Vincent Hale's leg instead, who had just stepped off the service elevator with his cart and who froze, unsure what he was even witnessing. Collins came next. She didn't go to Vincent. She reached for her mother's hand and held it, tight, the way she hadn't in over a year. And then Hadley Crow opened her mouth and said the first 5 words she had spoken aloud in 13 months. "Daddy said Gerald kill Smile." The room went completely silent. Peyton's breath caught somewhere in her chest and simply stopped. It would take hours to understand what those words meant, that the girls had overheard something at their father's funeral, standing close enough to a man in a dark suit to hear him murmur to someone beside him, "Let them stay mute forever. It kills her soul." 2 7-year-olds had carried that sentence, unspoken, for 13 months, believing that their silence was the only thing keeping their mother's soul intact. Peyton's hands shook so hard the drawing nearly slipped from her lap. "I let him," she said, barely a whisper, staring at nothing. I let him kill your soul, and I never even... She couldn't finish it. She just knelt there on the marble floor and sobbed, the sound raw and unguarded in a way that 13 months of composure had never once allowed. Peyton hadn't built a $3.8 billion empire because she loved power for its own sake. She built it because a balance sheet could be controlled, and grief could not. Hadley's 5 words didn't just expose Gerald. They exposed a deal Peyton had made with herself without ever saying it out loud. That competence could stand in for presence. Kneeling on that floor, she finally understood there was no acquisition, no strategy that could buy back a single one of the mornings she'd traded for a boardroom. Vincent stood very still, one hand still resting lightly against his mop cart. And for a moment, he wasn't in a 48-story penthouse on Lakeshore Drive at all. He was back in a hospital hallway years ago, waiting on word about Alan's mother, learning what it meant to hold a grief too big for words. He knew what it cost a person to stay quiet that long. He knew that silence wasn't the absence of feeling. It was feeling with nowhere left to go. He didn't say any of that out loud. There wasn't anything to say. He reached into his apron pocket, the same pocket that had carried butterscotch candy and a hidden USB drive for weeks, and pulled out a plain paper napkin and held it out. Peyton took it like it was the last solid thing in the world and pressed it against her face and held on to it long after her tears had dried. Later that night, once the girls were finally, exhaustedly asleep, Vincent finally opened the drive he'd carried in his pocket for 3 weeks. It was a single video file. Ethan Crow's face filled the screen, recorded on his phone in what looked like a parked car, exactly 1 week before the crash on Lakeshore Drive. "If anyone finds this," Ethan said, his voice low and steady, but his eyes betraying how frightened he actually was. "Gerald Vance forced me to short sell company stock through an offshore account. When I refused to keep doing it, he told me, very calmly, like he was discussing the weather, that he knew exactly where my daughters went to school. He said if anything happened to me, he'd be smiling at the funeral. I didn't believe he meant it. I should have." The video ended there. 31 seconds. It was enough. Peyton watched it standing in her own kitchen at midnight, and something in her that had been holding steady for 13 months simply broke apart. She sank to the floor in front of her own children's bedroom door and wept without composure, whispering apology after apology to 2 girls who were, for once, sleeping soundly enough not to hear her. By morning, word had already begun to leak. A business reporter with a source inside the tower, a headline forming somewhere in a newsroom. Billionaire's silent twins and a janitor versus the board. Nobody had confirmed anything officially. It didn't matter. By 9 a.m., the story had already jumped from a single tip to 3 different outlets, each one guessing at details none of them actually had. Emerson read the headline twice at her desk, then closed her laptop and sat with her hands flat on the surface, steadying herself. She had spent 11 years learning to protect this family from the outside world. It had taken her far too long to understand that the danger had never been outside at all. And somewhere across the city, in an office on the 31st floor, Gerald Vance's phone lit up with a forwarded video file, 31 seconds long, sent by someone inside his own camp who was starting, quietly, to have second thoughts about which side of this they wanted to be standing on. Gerald watched it once, all the way through, his face giving away nothing at all. Then he set the phone down, straightened his cufflinks, and picked up a different phone entirely. One that connected to a number very few people in his life had ever been given. Peyton Crow hadn't even caught her breath from the night before when, across the city, that call went through, and a single instruction left Gerald Vance's mouth in a voice as calm as if he were ordering lunch. Ruin them. Both of them. I don't care what it costs. 3 days after the board meeting, A Chicago snowstorm rolled in off Lake Michigan and buried Lakeshore Drive under 6 inches of ice and gridlock. That was the night Hadley's breathing turned into a thin, frightening whistle in the middle of dinner. It happened fast. One moment she was pushing peas around her plate, and the next her small chest was heaving, her lips going pale at the edges, her hands clutching at the collar of her shirt like she could pull more air in through sheer will. Peyton's training kicked in for exactly 3 seconds. Call 911, stay calm, don't panic. And then the panic came anyway. The panic of a mother who had already lost one person to a road she couldn't control. They said 40 minutes, she said into the phone, her voice climbing towards something close to screaming. The roads are... Nobody's moving. Nobody's... 2 floors below, Vincent Hale was finishing a long shift when he heard the call go out over building security's radio. He didn't think. He grabbed his bag and took the stairs 2 at a time, all 48 floors. Because his legs already knew where they were going before his mind caught up. He'd carried a bag like that once before, on a mountainside outside Kandahar, when there was no ambulance coming, and a man's life depended on what Vincent Hale remembered and how fast his hands could move. 11 years with the 75th Ranger Regiment had taught him things you didn't forget, not even after you hung up the uniform for good. He found Hadley on the kitchen floor, Peyton kneeling over her, hysterical, useless with fear in the specific way that only someone who has already buried one person can be. Vincent didn't ask permission. He knelt down, pulled a spare rescue inhaler from the bag he'd carried up 48 flights, and worked with calm, practiced hands. The kind he'd done before, under far worse conditions than a warm kitchen floor. 87 seconds. Peyton would remember counting them later, though at the time it felt like no time passed at all. Just the wet sound of Hadley trying to pull air past a throat that didn't want to open. And Vincent's voice, low and even, saying the same 3 words over and over. You're okay. You're okay. You're okay. Somewhere in there, Collins had crept in from the hallway and taken hold of her sister's other hand, silent tears running down her face, refusing to look away even once. Then, at last, the whistle in Hadley's chest broke apart into something closer to a normal breath. That's how long it took for the color to come back into her lips, for her small hand to finally uncurl and grab hold of Vincent's sleeve instead of her own collar. Nobody in that kitchen said a word for a long moment after. Peyton just sat on the floor, both arms around her daughter, staring at the man in the janitor's uniform like she was seeing him, really seeing him, for the very first time. What none of them knew yet was that the hallway security camera outside the penthouse had captured the whole thing. Within 4 minutes, a grainy clip was already circulating, leaked by someone on the building's own security team who understood exactly how much a story like this one was worth. By morning, it was everywhere. "Janitor saves billionaire's daughter," the headline said, and then, as reporters dug deeper, the story only grew. Former Special Operations medic, current volunteer at the Bridgeport Free Clinic 3 nights a week, unpaid for 6 years running. A single dad who worked 2 jobs and still found time to teach neighborhood kids CPR on Saturday mornings in the church parking lot on 35th Street. Gerald Vance watched the coverage build with the calm of a man calculating his next move. By that evening, he had arranged his own version of the story, a live-streamed statement flanked by 2 attorneys, his voice grave and rehearsed. This man infiltrated a private residence to insert himself into a vulnerable family, Gerald said into the cameras, not a single muscle in his face betraying the lie. He is dangerous. He has manipulated 2 traumatized children for his own gain. This board will not stand by while a stranger endangers Peyton Crow's daughters. It was, Vincent would think later, a remarkable thing to watch. How the same 87 seconds could be told as love by one voice and danger by another, depending entirely on which voice people had already decided to trust. That night, Alan called. and Vincent could hear from the very first breath that his son had been crying. "Dad," Alan said, his voice small and cracking in a way it hadn't in years. "People online are saying you're going to go to jail. They're saying you did something bad. I don't want to lose you like we lost Mom. I'm scared." Vincent sat down slowly on the edge of his own bed in Bridgeport, phone pressed hard against his ear, and kept his voice as steady as he could, because his son needed it more than anything else right now. "I haven't done a single thing wrong," he said. "You hear me? Not one thing. You stay home, you finish your homework, and you wait for me. I'll be there. I've always been there." He hung up and sat in the dark a long moment before his own phone rang again, this time an unfamiliar Chicago number. Chicago police, asking him to come in for questioning that same night regarding an anonymous complaint filed against him. He went. He had nothing to hide and every reason in the world to prove it. He sat across a plain metal table from a detective who kept glancing at a printed page of talking points, answering the same 3 questions, rephrased 6 different ways. Had he ever been alone with the girls without supervision? Had he ever asked them to keep a secret? Had he ever accepted money or gifts from Peyton Crow? Vincent answered every one, calmly, honestly, and watched the detective's own expression shift somewhere around the 4th question. The look of a man beginning to suspect he'd been handed a case that didn't actually add up. They let him go a little after midnight. No charges. Not yet, but the complaint would stay open on paper even after it closed in that room. And paper has a way of outliving the truth when the right person wants it to. Meanwhile, across the city, Peyton Crow watched her own company's stock ticker drop 37% in barely 2 hours, watched 2 of her personal accounts freeze without warning, pending a board review she hadn't authorized, and understood with sudden clarity exactly how much power Gerald Vance had quietly built for himself while she'd been too consumed with grief to notice. She found Vincent later that night in the lobby, still in his work clothes, waiting to be told whether he was free to go home to his son. She crossed the marble floor and wrapped both arms around him without a single word of warning, her whole body trembling. "You saved my daughter's life," she said into his shoulder, her voice breaking apart. "And now they want to take you away from us too." Vincent didn't answer right away. He just held still and let her hold on, the way he'd learned, a long time ago, that sometimes the only thing you can actually do for someone is not let go first. Neither of them knew yet what was already sitting in a courthouse filing system 3 blocks away. A petition, filed that same afternoon under Gerald Vance's name, requesting emergency custody proceedings and formally accusing Vincent Hale of endangering the well-being of a minor in his care. The court would hear the case in 48 hours. And whatever was left of the life Vincent Hale had built for his son in Bridgeport was about to be put on trial, right alongside it. The hostile takeover closed in 36 hours. 51% of the company Peyton Crow had built from nothing now belonged to a coalition Gerald Vance had quietly assembled for months, waiting for the right moment to strike. The rest of her personal accounts froze that same afternoon. The 2 his lawyers had flagged weeks earlier, now joined by everything else. By evening, an anonymous complaint reached the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services, citing the mother's psychological instability and the introduction of an unvetted, potentially dangerous individual into the children's environment. A caseworker recommended an emergency safety plan. A family court judge, one whose re-election campaign had received 2 separate donations from a firm tied to Gerald Vance, signed off within hours. The girls placed temporarily with Peyton's mother in Winnetka, pending a full custody hearing. Vincent was barred from coming within 500 meters of the tower. Buried in the same filing was a second threat entirely, a note that his own custody of Alan could be reviewed, given his connection to an active investigation. That was the sentence that finally broke something loose in Vincent Hale. Not the ban, not the accusations. The idea that any of this could reach his son. Security escorted him out of the building a little after 11 that night, snow falling thick and sideways down East Lakeshore Drive. They didn't wait for him to pack properly. His belongings came down after him in 2 cardboard boxes, set out on the sidewalk in the cold like garbage waiting for pickup. A spare uniform, a coffee mug Alan had painted for him in 3rd grade, the paperback he kept in his apron pocket for slow nights. Alan stood beside him on that sidewalk, 10 years old, snow catching in his curly hair, watching his father kneel down to gather a stranger's judgment of him back into a box. "Dad?" the boy said quietly, slipping his small hand into Vincent's. "Let's just go home, to Bridgeport. Don't cry, okay?" Vincent hadn't realized he was crying until his son said it. He wiped his face with the back of his glove, picked up both boxes at once, and started walking toward the minivan parked 3 blocks down, because the tower's own garage was, as of that morning, no longer a place he was permitted to stand. Alan walked beside him the whole way without saying another word, matching his father's pace through the snow, the way he'd always done since he was small enough to need to run just to keep up. He made the decision that night, sitting in the old minivan outside a building he was no longer welcome in, snow collecting on the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. If he stayed, they would use Alan against him. If he stayed, he would be the reason this family lost everything a second time. The only power he had left was walking away before someone else took that choice from him too. Vincent told himself this was protection, and part of it was. But underneath that was an older, quieter belief he'd carried since long before he ever pushed a mop cart. The belief that a man like him could only cost a family like this something, in the end, no matter how careful he was. He wasn't just running from Gerald's threats. He was running from the fear that if he stayed long enough, he'd eventually prove every person who'd ever looked at his boots and looked away right about him. Leaving felt like sacrifice. It was also, quietly, an old wound doing the talking. He wrote the note in the penthouse kitchen the next morning, during the 10 minutes Emerson quietly arranged for him to say goodbye. Plain handwriting on a torn sheet of notebook paper left on the counter beside the coffee maker. "I'm just a janitor. I'm not the kind of man who belongs in your world. Please don't try to find me. Live well. All 3 of you deserve to." Peyton found it an hour later and read it standing in the middle of an empty penthouse, and something in her simply gave out. She sank to the marble floor in the same spot she'd knelt weeks earlier, asking Hadley a question she already knew the answer to. And this time, nobody came to find her. She read the note 4 more times, and then she folded it once, carefully, and put it in the same drawer where Ethan's letter had once waited 13 months to be found. 2 men now, she thought. 2 men who had tried to tell her the truth, and both times she'd been too late to listen. The girls went silent again that same afternoon. Not gradually, but all at once, like a door closing. They wouldn't eat dinner. Hadley wouldn't touch the Mop Man drawings still taped to the refrigerator. Colin stopped holding anyone's hand at all. 13 months of silence, back in full, in less than a single day. The company's stock dropped another 22% by the closing bell. Emerson tried once to stop him, catching Vincent in the parking garage as he loaded the last box into the old minivan. "Don't do this," she said. "Not now, not when they finally—" "If I stay," Vincent said, cutting her off gently but firmly, "they take Alan from me too. I've already lost enough people to things I couldn't control. I'm not losing my son to something I actually can." He shut the door of the minivan and Emerson stood alone in the garage, listening to the old engine cough twice before it finally turned over. Peyton stood in front of the penthouse's security monitor that night, unable to look away from the black and white feed of her daughters sitting in the window seat exactly the way they had 13 months ago. Hadley hugging the same worn rabbit, Collins tracing shapes into fogged glass, neither one making a sound. She had spent $13 billion months chasing every expert money could buy. It had taken one quiet man with a mop cart 3 weeks to bring her daughters back to her, and one board meeting to lose him again. Somewhere in Bridgeport, Vincent Hale sat at his own kitchen table long after Alan had finally fallen asleep, staring at a duffel bag, half-packed, for a city he hadn't chosen yet, wondering if he'd just done the bravest thing he'd ever done, or the worst mistake of his life. He had lost the only 2 little girls who had ever fully trusted him. He had lost a woman he hadn't even let himself admit he loved. He was about to lose the city that had been his family's home for 3 generations. What Vincent didn't know, what nobody but Emerson knew yet, was that she'd spent 2 nights combing through the building's archive security servers until she recovered the one file everyone had forgotten: the footage of Gerald outside the chapel doors, 13 months old. She'd spent hours on the phone with a contact she'd known for a decade at the Securities and Exchange Commission, quietly handing over the offshore trading records piece by piece until nothing could be buried again. What none of them knew, not Vincent, not Peyton, not even Gerald Vance, standing in his corner office already counting his victory, was that Emerson Quinn hadn't gone home that night at all. She was still sitting in her car outside the tower, phone in hand, staring at a single video file she hadn't sent anywhere yet. There was still one card left on the table, and she was about to play it in front of the entire world. Emerson Quinn had spent 11 years being the quietest person in every room she walked into. That night, she made sure the entire world heard her at once. She used her own credentials, the ones nobody had thought to revoke, to break into the company's global shareholder livestream, the one Gerald Vance himself had called to announce the board's final consolidation of power. More than 10 million people were already watching when the feed cut, went black for 4 seconds, and came back showing something the board had never authorized: Ethan Crow's face. 31 seconds, word for word. Then the audio recording, Gerald's own voice promising to pay someone to keep 2 little girls silent for 18 months. Then, grainy security footage from a funeral 13 months old showing Gerald Vance smiling outside a chapel door while 2 children stood frozen with grief. Then, last, the hallway footage. Vincent Hale on his knees on a kitchen floor, 87 seconds, saving a little girl's life with nothing but steady hands and 11 years of training. The boardroom went dead silent. And then 2 small figures walked out onto that stage, led gently by the hand. Hadley and Collins Crow stood in front of a camera broadcasting to millions of strangers, and for the first time in 13 months, they spoke, clearly, together, in voices that had been waiting a very long time to be used. "Gerald killed our smile," Hadley said. "Mr. Vincent brought it back." Collins finished it, quieter but just as steady. "We were never really mute. We were just waiting for someone to actually see us." Nobody in that room said a word. Somewhere in trading floors across the country, the company's stock, already battered from weeks of chaos, turned around and climbed 418% in 11 minutes flat. Federal agents were already in the building. Emerson had spent days quietly feeding them everything: the offshore accounts, the short-selling records, the recovered footage, and they'd been waiting for the right public moment to move. Gerald Vance was arrested on that stage, in front of the cameras, in front of the same board that had nodded along with every word he'd ever said only days before. Not one of them met his eyes as they led him out. Appearances, it turned out, had never been the kind of power he thought they were. Peyton Crow stood up in front of 27 million live viewers, her hair loose, her eyes red, and said the only thing that felt true anymore. For 13 months, Peyton had measured her own worth in the only currency she trusted, numbers she could control, market share, therapy hours logged, nannies hired and lost. Numbers never asked her to sit with how frightened she actually was. Standing on that stage wasn't really about choosing Vincent over the company. It was Peyton finally admitting that the empire had never been what kept her daughters safe in the first place. Presence was. It cost her $2.1 billion to learn what a broken vase and a quiet man with a mop cart had already taught her daughters for free. I'm resigning as CEO, effective immediately. I'm selling 60% of my shares for $2.1 billion, and every cent of it is going toward the Hale Presence Foundation. 12 free health clinics right here across Chicago, named for a man who taught me that presence is worth more than any empire I ever built. She paused, searching the back of the room until she found him. I don't need the company anymore. I need the man who did the impossible and brought my daughters back to me. Her voice shook. Vincent Hale, will you marry me? Will you be their father and Alan's mother's partner for the rest of however long we've got? Vincent, brought quietly through a side door by Emerson only moments before, stood frozen for exactly one heartbeat. Then he nodded, hands trembling, and crossed the stage as Hadley and Collins ran into him first, Alan right behind them. All three kids colliding into one tangled, laughing, crying hug. In the weeks that followed, the pieces Gerald had spent 13 months arranging came apart. The judge who'd signed the emergency safety plan recused himself the moment his campaign donations became public record, and full custody was restored to Peyton within days. The girls back on the 48th floor before the month was out. The complaint against Vincent closed without a single charge ever filed. The detective who'd questioned him that snowy night later admitted he'd known within the first 10 minutes it didn't add up. Nobody ever came for Alan's custody at all. It had never been anything but a threat meant to make a good man leave quietly. And once the truth was standing in front of 27 million witnesses, there was no quiet left for anyone to hide in. A year later, a small storefront called Presence Coffee opened on Clark Street in Lincoln Park. Nothing fancy, just good coffee and a piano nobody ever bothered to keep quiet anymore. Kids' laughter carried through the whole place most afternoons. The refrigerator at home stayed covered edge to edge in Mop Man drawings, dozens of them by now, each one a little different. Vincent still worked a night shift twice a week, not because anyone needed him to, but because he liked what silence sounded like now. Earned, chosen, peaceful instead of forced. The old porch swing back in Bridgeport still creaked too, even though he'd finally gotten around to painting it. Some things, Miss Betty liked to remind him, were better left just a little imperfect. Peyton learned to make sandwiches that were, by her own honest admission, genuinely terrible, and nobody in that house ever once complained. Hadley and Collins called him Dad, like it was the easiest word they'd ever learned. Alan started calling Peyton Mom Number 2 within a month, and she cried the first time he said it, and laughed about it every time after. This story reminds us that presence isn't a feeling you wait around for. It's a decision you make again until it becomes a habit nobody can talk you out of. You don't need Vincent's mop cart or Peyton's checkbook to give somebody that same gift. You just need to keep showing up. Here's what that can look like this week. Every Sunday at 4 o'clock, before the game comes on, call your grandson and ask him one real question about his life. Then stay quiet long enough to actually hear the whole answer, instead of filling the silence yourself. If 2 chairs still sit out on your porch, put a glass of sweet tea in both of them on Wednesday evenings, the way you used to, and let the empty one stay right where it is instead of dragging it back inside out of habit. Keep his reading glasses on the nightstand exactly where he set them down that last night. Not because you're stuck there, but because some mornings, reaching for something that was his is the whole point of the morning. You don't have to fix anybody's entire life. You just have to be the one who keeps showing up. Same porch, same chair, same hour, until somebody finally starts talking again. No one could handle the billionaire's twin daughters, until a single dad janitor did the impossible simply by showing up. Have you ever shown up for someone when it would have been easier to walk away? Comment yes below if you believe one small act of kindness can change an entire life. These powerful stories were written by real people with deep emotions and life experience, with AI serving only as a supportive tool to help polish the language and deliver valuable lessons of justice, kindness, and resilience to millions of viewers.